Hello, this week we will explore the notion of media bias. We will talk about what people typically mean when they talk about media bias, and I will challenge you to think about other factors beyond the individual political biases that influence the information that we get from media. So, what is media bias? Relatively speaking, bias in the news refers to the decisions that news producers, like journalists, make in selecting and covering the news. It relates to a larger question: what forces influence the information that the audience receives? In the discussion of media bias in the United States, we often focus on one potential influencing factor, and that is an individual's political leanings. In fact, polls measuring the public's perception of bias often focus on liberal versus conservative bias. Here are the results of a 2012 poll conducted by the Gallup Polling Group, which says that nearly half of Americans, at 46%, perceive the news media of having too much of a liberal bias. Just 13%, on the other hand, thought the media were too conservative. A little over a third that media lack any bias in any direction. I'll say that again. A little over a third think that the media lacks any bias in either direction. As you may expect, someone identified politically has their perceptions influenced about media bias. For example, 75% of those identifying as Republicans thought that the media was too liberal, whereas only 16% of those identifying as Democrat detected a liberal bias. This attitude extremity explains some of the perception of media bias. Research suggests that where one stands politically determines whether and when or what we perceive when we look at the media and look for bias. Essentially, we see what we want to see. Even individual sources of news are considered to be politically biased. For example, many claim that Fox is for conservatives, MSNBC is for liberals, and the Associated Press is more balanced. If you look at the chart here, which is a 2020 chart, you can see that the AP kind of heads up the center of the road type of non-biased media, but that also includes some publications like USA Today. I would disagree with the Wall Street Journal there, because it is owned by Jeff Bezos, and he has a political leaning. You can see MSNBC, Newsweek, and Huffington Post over there on the far left. And then on the right, of course, a publication like the American Conservative would be conservative. Fox News, of course, but way to the right, you have such news organizations as the American Spectator, the National Review, and sometimes even the New York Post. I don't know how much you can depend on the New York Post, but it does tend to lean to the right. In addition to saying what we want, I'm going to have to start over again. In addition to seeing what we want to see, we often use sources that match with our worldview. This is called selective exposure. Conservatives choose conservative sources and liberals choose liberal sources. A 2009 study explored these theories and how individuals perceive the media bias in the Comedy Central show The Colbert Report. The researchers found that the more conservative the respondent says they were, the more they thought Colbert was pretending to be funny, but actually agrees with the conservative ideologies, whereas liberals thought that Colbert was using satire and making fun of such ideologies. So if you're a Republican, you thought he secretly believed in it, and if you were a liberal, you thought he was using satire. Beyond political ideology and bias, there are other ways to think about how our media are influenced. In the next few slides, we'll look at some other influences on media content. It's not just political bias of individual journalists that influences how the news is covered. It includes individuals, groups, and societal factors. Researchers Pamela Shoemaker and Stephen Reese, both of whom I studied under at the University of Texas, wrote a book exploring the various factors that influence messages. Their system includes 5 levels or types of influence: individual, routines, organizational, extramedia, and ideological. The first is the individual level, which refers to how an individual media worker's characteristics influence their decisions. This can influence political leanings, but it can also influence such factors as simply background, education, or how one sees his or her own role in the news organization. We talked about objectivity last time and how we bring in our backgrounds, our thoughts, our feelings, our beliefs. So those factors can bias or influence the bias we have when we act as a journalist. Next level is routines, which simply refers to the set of patterns, usual activities, and procedures that are part of most media organizations. For example, how we define newsworthiness, which we also discussed last week, relates to standard ways we have of determining if some sort of stories would be interesting to an audience. So if we find stories that have a lot of prominence, a lot of famous people in it, it'll influence the fact that we would cover stories like that or run stories like that, as opposed to maybe stories about conflict. Another routine that we may use is using the same sources over and over again. Sometimes it might be due to a time constraint. Another example might be just the structure of how journalists do their job. What time they get there, what time they take their breaks, what time they go home. It can greatly influence the content they produce and what the consumer eventually sees. The next is organizational, which refers to the structure of goals and ownership of media organizations. I think this is a really strong bias, especially with media ownership. For example, is a news organization structured so that the newsroom is separate from the marketing department? Or is the news organization owned by a local person who cares about the community? Or is it owned by a large conglomerate that that might be more removed from the situation, the community, the audience? The first one about the marketing department, I know that if an advertiser gets an ad from a company, they always kind of wander over to the news part of the publication and say, hey, haven't you done it? Or maybe you should do a story about this company that started advertising with us. That is bias, that is unethical, that is smarmy, for a lack of a better word. So I really think there should be a solid wall between marketing, advertising, and the editorial news department. The fourth level is extramedia, which simply refers to those factors in organizations outside of the media organization itself that still exert some influence. For example, revenue sources such as the audience and the advertisers can influence the content. Let's say you have someone who does advertise on your network, and they call up and say, hey, we really didn't like that story you did about blank. Well, maybe that will influence if you run another story about it, or if you cut back on those types of stories. Well, it's not specifically the news here, but this example is about 1980s TV shows that were actually made by toy companies that ran their products simply to sell toys. For example, Transformers, robots in disguise. Public relations groups might also influence the content. They can do this by making only certain sources available. You can only talk to their media practitioner rather than the boss themselves. So that's how other organizations outside of the media organization itself can influence what goes into a story or not. And finally, the last level is ideological. It does not refer to an individual's ideological perspective, but rather a general perceived ideology of a community or a culture. For example, dominant U.S. culture celebrates capitalism, private ownership, and free markets. So we would cover a story with that bent in mind. This theological perspective, therefore, influences the frames which we tell our media, what we look at, what we don't look at, what we say, what we don't say, to tell our stories. Ultimately, these roles interact with one another. For example, the individual is influenced by her routines, which is influenced by the company she works for, which are influenced by other or related organizations, which are influenced by the overarching cultural values. And that's our lecture for this week.